Hello and welcome to British History, Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm Carol Ann Lloyd. You can find me at carolannlloyd.com or at @ShakeUpHistory on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Please follow so we can explore history together. This month at Royals, Rebels, and Romantics, we're leaning into romance big time. It's February, so it's Valentine's month. We'll be exploring the most famous and infamous love stories of history and literature. I'm asking for your input, so get ready to share your thoughts about romance. In honor of Valentine's Day, we're celebrating love stories this month. And I thought I'd start with someone who should have been an expert, someone who would have personally supported chocolate and flower vendors had he lived in another time, Henry VIII. So I asked my people, fellow Tudor fans and enthusiasts, some important questions. Which wife did Henry VIII love most? Who was his favorite? And who loved him most? And in this quest to find Henry's true Valentine, I've heard from many people who have strong feelings about the matter. It's been exciting to hear and read your thoughts about that much-marrying monarch and his quest for true love. Now, speaking of the Six Wives, if you can't get enough of the most famous wives club in history, and if you're listening before 24th of February 2021, please join Agecroft Hall for a really fun look at the Six Wives in pop culture. From opera to The Simpsons to the flashy new musical Six, the Six Wives are everywhere, as they should be. We'll be looking at the relationship between the history and the fun. The online program is the 24th of February at 6 p.m. You can find registration info at www.agecrofthall.org or on my website, carolannlloyd.com. Or reach out to me through social media at ShakeUpHistory, and I can send you all the info. I'd love to see you there. So back to Henry. I think a key reason that Henry VIII had so much trouble making a successful marriage is that he wanted to have a marriage that fulfilled his personal as well as his political needs. In the 16th century, that wasn't how it worked, at least among royalty. Marriages were business agreements designed to form political alliances and strengthen the realm. If a king wanted personal affection, well, that's what mistresses were for. Look at Francis I. He married Princess Claude, eldest daughter of Louis XII, to solidify his position as heir and gain her inheritance to Brittany. He mostly ignored her, only interested in her ability to bear him sons. Claude did provide Francis an heir who became Henry II after Francis's death. For his personal needs, Francis had a series of mistresses, including Mary Boleyn. So that was enough to keep him busy. Why would Henry VIII expect his own experience to be different? I think it comes down to his parents. The marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York was made for purely political reasons. Henry Tudor promised to marry Elizabeth of York as a political statement, a symbolic way to unite the houses of York and Lancaster. He would marry her to incorporate her claim to the throne into his claim. He had no relationship with her. In fact, the marriage plan may have started with their mothers. It's rumored that Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville communicated while Elizabeth was in sanctuary and planned that Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York would take the crown from Richard III. Henry's first parliament overturned the law making Elizabeth of York and her siblings illegitimate to pave the way for Richard to take the throne. Then they married. Their early marriage fulfilled expectations of a political marriage. She became pregnant quickly and gave birth to a son 8 months after the wedding. After that, she was crowned on the 25th of November, 1487. As the marriage went on over the years, the two grew closer. The death of Prince Arthur gives us an interesting window into the personal relationship between the king and queen. When Henry first received news of his son's death, he asked that the queen be brought in so they could comfort each other. Contemporary reports describe Elizabeth reassuring Henry that they still had a son, And after all, his own mother had given birth just once, and that son had lived. She also said they were young enough to have more children. After the two of them spoke for a while, Elizabeth returned to her own chamber and collapsed in her own grief. Her servants sent for the king, who came in and comforted her. It's an intimate moment of parents grieving for the loss of a child and a mother and father comforting each other. This was what their arranged marriage had turned into. They looked to each other for comfort and personal affection. That's the marriage young Prince Henry was raised with. I think it's fair to say that his experience with his parents' marriage led him to believe that marriage would be a source of personal satisfaction as well as political power. And it would most certainly produce sons. Henry VIII. So, in my very unofficial and completely fascinating surveys on social media, who wins the prize for Henry's greatest love, favorite wife, and true Valentine? I asked the question in slightly different ways, and I did get some different answers. Thank you to everyone who chimed in. I really love all the things you said. Some people felt that Henry's greatest love was Henry himself. I totally understand this, but I need to disagree to some extent. I think Henry was quite desperate to be loved, especially after the loss of his mother. I think many of his actions betray an insecurity that is prevalent in Tudor monarchs, an underlying recognition that their tentative claim to the throne and desire to hide any doubts under layers of bravado and self-congratulation. I think Henry was certainly in love with being in love and searching for someone who would love him with unquestioned devotion, not just as king, but also as himself. I'm not sure he would ever have found someone to fill all those needs. The three women who received the most votes were the first three wives, although everyone received at least a few votes or mentions. This isn't surprising, really. These first three wives bore his children, ensured the continuation of his dynasty, and shaped his life. In my count, Catherine of Aragon came in third, with Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour pretty much tied for first. So let's take a look at these three women and their relationships with Henry. Catherine of Aragon. Catherine knew Henry first, longest, and probably best. She met him as a boisterous child who accompanied her along her wedding procession and then stole the show at the post-wedding celebration by dancing with such abandon that he threw off his doublet and danced with his shirt. All of this was intended to celebrate Catherine's marriage to his brother Arthur. After Arthur's death, Henry and Catherine both experienced a remarkable lack of kindness from Henry VII, as the king tried to shield his son from any fun that might endanger him, and to use Catherine to get all the money he could out of Ferdinand of Aragon. The idea of Catherine being sort of a damsel in distress appealed to Prince Henry. When Henry VII died, the new king immediately declared he would marry Catherine and start his reign with her at his side. Henry and Catherine were married quietly on the 11th of June, 1509, and then crowned together as king and queen consort on the 24th of June in an elaborate celebration. She suffered an early miscarriage, or stillbirth, and then gave birth to a son on January 1st, 1511. The child was named Henry, and there were celebrations and festivities, including the Westminster tournament in February. But the young prince died before he turned 2 months old. Princess Mary was later born in 1516, and there would be no more children. There are rumors the king was having an affair with Anne or Elizabeth Hastings before a definite relationship with Bessie Blount that resulted in the birth of a boy. The king immediately acknowledged the child as his, and the baby boy was christened Henry Fitzroy, Fitzroy meaning son of king. In 1525, the king created Fitzroy the Duke of Richmond, which some saw as Henry taking a step toward naming Richmond instead of Princess Mary as his heir. This infuriated Catherine, who truly believed Mary was capable of ruling the country. That fact, Catherine's absolute belief that Mary could rule, was the heart of the problem between Henry and Catherine. Henry seemed genuinely surprised that Catherine didn't understand his need for a son. After all those years of living together and sharing delight in Mary and devastation as little Prince Henry died and the other pregnancies ending in tragedy, Henry VIII somehow never really understood that Catherine was the daughter of a ruling queen who believed in a queen's ability to rule. Henry loved Catherine, but he hadn't really known her. Or at least he hadn't known a major element of who she was. So I don't think she was his greatest love. I do think she probably loved him more than any of his other wives did. She knew him at his best and continued to believe in that potential. And I think she meant it at the end of her life when, even after everything he had put her through, she wrote that her greatest desire was to see him again. Jane Seymour. I know, I'm out of order. I think Jane was Henry's favorite wife. And I think that is 100% because she gave him what he desired most of all, a legitimate son. He gives us plenty of clues about her favored status. He was devastated by her death, even though there's that rumor that he told him if they had to choose between Mary and the baby to save the baby because he could always get another wife. She certainly died at the right moment when she had accomplished what no one else had or would and was in her glory. Henry also inserts Jane into a family portrait that was created around 1545, toward the end of his reign while he was married to Catherine Parr. Henry is in center stage, of course, and he is flanked by his son Edward and Jane Seymour, who had been dead 8 years. In reality, Henry had been married 3 more times since Jane's death, but for the purposes of his family image, Jane and Edward are at his side. I think this is a compelling indication she was officially his favorite wife. Henry also chose to be buried alongside Jane in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Of course, as Tracy Borman points out, Henry's best friend Charles Brandon was also buried there. So there might be additional reasons Henry chose Windsor. Still, although Jane ended up being his favorite, I think that was because she was the only one to give him a son, rather than because he loved her most. In fact, Henry and James didn't seem to experience that honeymoon period that happened with his first 2 wives. The king was unhappy that Jane didn't become pregnant immediately. Contemporary reports say that he was keeping company with other attractive women and actually told them he wished he had met them before marrying. Henry called out Jane's behavior twice in front of witnesses. When she petitioned to have Mary returned to court, Henry snapped that she should be more concerned about her own children. This was clearly a dig, as Jane was not yet pregnant. Then later, when Jane pled for mercy for participants in the Pilgrimage of Grace, Henry said she should not meddle in his affairs and that she should remember what had happened to her predecessor. Since Anne Boleyn had been beheaded at the king's command, it must have been pretty devastating for Jane to hear that. Certainly, once Edward was born, Jane could do no wrong, especially since she died in her moment of glory before she could annoy the king again. I agree that she was his favorite wife, but I think that's because she gave him Edward, not because he loved her most. So which wife did Henry love most? I'm sure you saw this coming from a mile away, and I know it's an obvious choice, but I'm sticking with it. I think Henry loved Anne Boleyn the most. Anne Boleyn. Yes, he had her executed. And yes, they had terrible fights that often played out in public. And he may have even hated her at the end. But I still believe that Henry loved Anne most of all. Henry met Anne Boleyn when he was in his prime. He had grown into his position as king and was playing confidently in the royal arena with rivals Francis I of France and Charles V of the Habsburg Empire. He was wealthy and famous. His wife was 6 years older, and that was starting to matter. Henry had had a son with Bessie Blount, proving to the world he was capable of having a son. He was starting to feel ready to look to the future of his family. Enter Anne Boleyn. She grew up in the courts of Margaret of Austria and 2 queens of France. With Margaret, Anne learned to speak French fluently. She learned the art of dressing and behaving gracefully, of entertaining visiting artists and courtiers, and of navigating court and national politics. Margaret of Austria wrote to Thomas Boleyn, praising Anne and thanking him for sending the young woman to her court. To be singled out, in the most famous and elegant court in Europe was quite an accomplishment. From there, Anne was selected to be a member of the young French queen's retinue. Henry VIII had sent his sister Mary to France to marry Louis XII in 1514. Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary were part of the queen's household. The marriage lasted just a couple of months, and Mary Tudor returned to England, having secretly married Charles Brandon. Possibly because of her facility with the French language and her ability to act as a translator, Anne Boleyn stayed in France in the household of the new queen, Claude. The French court was a glittering place, and Anne would have encountered two remarkable women, the king's mother, Louis of Savoy, and his sister, Marguerite of Angoulême, also known as Marguerite of Navarre. Anne may have developed some kind of relationship with Marguerite at this time, and their paths do cross again. Anne served in the French court for several years, and was probably part of the group that Queen Claude brought to the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. Perhaps Anne saw Henry there. Anne returned to England in 1522 to be married to her Irish cousin, James Butler. There's a record of Anne participating in the court pageant Chateau Vert alongside many members of the court. Ironically, Anne played the virtue of perseverance. The marriage with Butler came to nothing, and Anne fell in love with Henry Percy, son of the Earl of Northumberland. They entered into some kind of betrothal, but their plans to marry were denied by Thomas Wolsey. There is a debate over whether Henry VIII was actually behind the decision to break up Anne and Percy. Anne left court for a while and returned to join the household of Queen Catherine. Around this time, Mary Boleyn was the king's mistress, so Catherine of Aragon might not have been too thrilled to have another Boleyn girl in her household. Little did she know. We don't know exactly when Anne caught the king's eye, but it seems to have been around 1526 or 27. Anne had learned to play the game of courtly love in the Austrian and French courts, and Henry VIII had met his match. Her looks, her style, her manners were different from the typical English lady, and this appealed to Henry. He wanted to take their relationship from the courtly level to an actual level, but Anne, who was savvy and strategic, was not interested in being a temporary plaything, even for the king. She said no. This appealed to Henry even more, turning him into an ardent and determined pursuer. Anne left court on occasion, and we have several letters the king wrote to Anne while she was away. For him to have actually written the letters is evidence itself of his love, as he hated to write letters and seldom took the trouble. In these letters, he sounds like a lovesick schoolboy. He writes that he is, quote, beseeching you earnestly to let me know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us two. And, seeing that I cannot personally be with you, I now send you the nearest thing to that, namely, my picture set in a bracelet. I mean, what else could you want besides the king's picture? He frequently draws a heart around their initials and signs his name with little code love messages embedded. I think these letters definitely show a man in love. So that's the personal story. The other is political, and it still shows Henry's love for Anne. As she won't be his mistress, he decided to make her his wife. He acted clumsily, tipping his hand and alerting Catherine of Aragon too early of his plans, but he planned to annul his first marriage. When that didn't go as smoothly as he had assumed it would, again, I think because he had no idea who Catherine really was, he dug in for the long haul, and it was a long haul. He worked and worked and worked for this new marriage. He went through Thomas Wolsey and found Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer. Yeah, one day we'll have to look at all those Thomases. Eventually, the king defied his counsel and his subjects' wishes to defy the Pope and break with Rome. Henry made Anne Marquess of Pembroke, a noble in her own right, the first time a woman had ever been so honored. He took her on an official visit to France, at his side as if she were already his wife and queen. He married her in secret and then declared her queen in public. He arranged for a splendid coronation, using St. Edward's crown, something always previously reserved for the monarch, not the consort. He had turned his world upside down and inside out for her, and all she needed to do was give him a son. Which, of course, turned out to be something she couldn't do. I don't think it all fell apart after Elizabeth's birth on the 7th of September, 1533, even though that certainly cracked the foundation of their relationship. In the following months, Henry and Anne were described as being, quote, married together, a description that doesn't appear with any of the other wives. And finally, even when it all falls completely apart, I think the speed of Anne's disgrace, from sitting next to the king at the May Day joust on the 1st of May, 1536, knowing something is wrong but still being recognized as Queen of England, to being arrested, tried, found guilty, and executed less than 20 days later, speaks to a recognition among Anne's enemies, like Cromwell and the Seymours, that Henry could change his mind and take her back. They needed her gone, and fast. I think they knew that he loved her. So that's my case for Henry loving Anne Boleyn the most. And of course, that doesn't mean the other wives don't matter. They do. Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr in particular had lasting relationships with Mary and Elizabeth that were really vital. And Catherine Howard shows us what I think is the very worst side of Henry VIII, his need for a teenager to fit into the impossible mold he cast for her, and his fury when she turned out to be merely human. Anyway, thank you for sharing your thoughts about Henry and his wives, his favorite, and who he loved the most. I'd love to keep hearing from you. And we are continuing the love stories next month. We're turning to literary romances. So think about this. Who are the most romantic couples in Jane Austen? Thank you so much for listening to Stories of Romantics in Days Gone By. I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe, share, leave a rating, leave a comment, and especially let me know what you think. History shows us what's possible. Please join me next time as we explore history together. Cheers.